On the night that changed Corey Carson's life, the rain was quiet and misty. The delicate accumulation turned the pavement into a trembling mirror that appeared to smear the streetlights into watery stars. Corey was a very diligent and studious 16-year-old and in his junior year of high school. He was anticipating early graduation. He was heading back home from the library. His backpack was heavy with books and soaked with rain. He rode his bike for transportation, mostly for freedom, but to also relieve the task from his parents. He needed a new one. The right pedal on his bike had a loose crank that clicked with every rotation, and the tires were wearing. On rainy days, he always rode with one earbud in and the other dangling, letting the sound of the wet tires on asphalt create a mixtape with the bass line of his favorite songs. Corey was usually vigilant. On this night, he wasn't in a hurry. He was in deep thought about a history paper and whether he'd remembered to feed the dog that afternoon. Deep in thought, he never saw the car. Only two sudden, blinding lights rapidly erupting from the gloom. He heard the sharp, ear-piercing shriek of rubber fighting pavement. It was a sound that knew it was already too late. The brakes lost its battle against the slick asphalt. The light swallowed Corey, and in the matter of seconds, both he and the driver's life would be eternally changed. Welcome to Behind the Yellow Tape. I'm Mimi, and here we share some of the most spine-chilling, gut-stirring, mysterious crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. So if mystery and crime is your cup of tea, then you'll definitely get your fill here. We upload every Wednesday at 6 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you love a midweek dose of suspense, whether from your favorite seat, the car, before bed, or during your favorite activity, then leave a like to help build the algorithm. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss an upload. Now, let's take a step behind the yellow tape. When paramedics arrived, Corey was in critical condition. Once reaching the hospital and receiving emergency evaluation, doctors discovered that he suffered from traumatic brain damage, shattered tibial plateau, and bruised spinal cord. A verdict no parent could even fathom. The city absorbed the story as another hit and run and moved on. But in the aftermath of the accident, one man stayed. He stayed as the first wail of the siren cut through the drizzle. He stayed hiding in the darkness of that tragic rainy night, standing in the alcove of a closed shop front. He'd seen it all. He watched the boy's body arc through the air, limp and weightless. He did not run to help. He watched the paramedics work under the jaundiced glow of the streetlights, their movements efficient, hopeless. He watched the rain patter onto the boy's pale, still face, and in that moment, a terrible silent transaction was made. A life for a life. A debt was incurred in the blood and rain. He stood paralyzed, his hands trembling so violently the cigarette he previously lit remained unsmoked. He turned and walked away, flicking the unsmoked cigarette into a puddle. That night would turn the life of a beloved son into the demise of another man's empire. 10 years post-accident, the same man that hid in the darkness of grief would stand under the bright, forgiving lights of a high school gymnasium in a custom-made suit. He would practice a humble smile as the mayor called him a pillar of the community, a philanthropist, a local hero. He would accept the polished Citizen of the Year plaque to the warm, trusting applause of hundreds. No one in that room would think to ask the obvious, searing question. Why does a good man have to try so desperately, so publicly, to be good? The day Robert Benson accepted the Citizen of the Year award, he cried. He didn't cry a sincere cry, he cried public sobs of a man overwhelmed by fame. It was something quieter, more private. As his name echoed through the gymnasium of the very youth center he'd built, his hand rose slowly to cover his mouth. The tears that welled in his eyes were not of joy, but of an almost painful relief. The Benson Hope Youth Center gym was bursting at the seams. It was the heart of his life's work. Parents lined the back walls, arms crossed, nodding in communal pride. Children sat cross-legged on the polished hardwood floor, fidgeting with joy. Teachers held smartphones capturing a local saint in his natural habitat. The banner behind the podium didn't scream his name. It stated a quiet, undeniable fact. Community is built by those who stayed. Robert Benson had stayed. For 30 years, through factory closures and budget cuts, through the rise and fall of mayors, he had been the fixed point in the neighborhood's turning world. At 52, he dressed like a man who long ago stopped trying to impress anyone. A beige cardigan, soft and worn at the elbows, brown sensible shoes, polished but creased. His thinning gray hair was combed neatly but made no attempt to conceal the peaking of his scalp. He was intentional in his kindness, a hand on a teenager's shoulder, a knee bent to a child at eye level, a hug that was firm and genuine. He knew which kid loved dinosaurs and which one was scared of climbing rope. He knew which teenagers were going to what colleges. He even went as far as handling the maintenance work himself. At the podium, he thanked his wife, Jamie Benson, first. He spoke of her patience, her strength, her belief in this place. When he smiled at her in the front row, it was a smile that transformed his entire face. It was the smile of a good man. 3 days after the ceremony, his well-orchestrated gig was up. The children were in class, and Robert was in his small, cluttered office reviewing a grant application for new basketball hoops. The sound of the gym's double doors swinging open was too forceful for an average day's delivery. The footsteps that followed were heavy and measured. 3 FBI agents moved with a calm, disruptive gravity. The lead agent, Thaddeus Hollis, held up a badge to a young assistant. His voice was low but carried across the hollow space. "We need everyone to calmly exit the building." There were no shouts or struggle. The children were ushered out a side door, confused and quiet. Parents, alerted by frantic texts, began to gather outside, this time not raising their phones in celebration, but to document a shocking public fail. Disturbed from all the commotion, Robert emerged from his office with a pen still in his hand. He looked at the lead agent, and in that moment, there was a silent understanding that the performance was over. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't protest. He simply nodded, as if he'd been waiting for this knock for a very long time. Robert was cuffed and hauled away to the county police station. When the charges hit the evening news, the town was stunned. Benson Hope Youth Center, wire fraud, money laundering, theft of public funds, each headline heavier than the last. $3.2 million gone. The public reeled. The conversation of evidence and if Robert Benson had done it bubbled over in the town. The question that haunted people was far more unsettling. Why would a man who lived like he owned nothing steal everything? Sadie Moran despised cases like this. Not for their complexity, she lived for the tangled ledgers and disguised transactions. What she hated was the narrative that preceded them. The smug collective sigh of a town saying, "We should have known." It made the investigation feel like a coroner signing a certificate for a body everyone else had already pronounced dead. As the lead forensic accountant for the state attorney's office, Sadie was a professional myth killer. She didn't believe in good men gone bad. She believed in balance sheets, in incentives, and the emotionless architecture of greed. At first glance, Robert Benson's financial structure was insultingly sensible. The mistake was the sloppiness of a man believing in his own publicity. Fake invoices from contractors who didn't exist. Duplicate grant applications sent to different agencies for the same urgent roof repair. A series of shell companies with names like Community Horizons LLC, all registered to the same rented P.O. box in a strip mall 2 towns over. The money moved in a lazy circular dance. From the foundation's main account, to the sub-account, to one of the shells, and then out again. It was a pattern designed to look complicated to a casual auditor, but to Sadie, it was like hiding a giraffe behind a shower curtain. Detective Mark Ferris, the arresting officer, dropped the initial evidence file on her desk. He pronounced the findings as an open and shut case. He spoke of it as the equivalent of skimming the collection plate, but instead of skimming from church, Benson was skimming from children. The beloved coach embezzling league fees, the church treasurer funding a gambling habit. The pattern of betrayal was a cliche. But as Sadie built the financial timeline, a quiet dissonance began to brew in her mind. It wasn't the fraud that intrigued her, it was the absence. The search warrant showed Robert and his wife Jamie lived a surprisingly modest life in a 3-bedroom ranch house. The home resided in the same neighborhood as the youth center. The mortgage was small and paid off. His car was an old model sedan, and Jamie drove a minivan with a dented bumper. Their bank accounts didn't reflect sudden spikes, luxury purchases, or clandestine trips. Sadie didn't find any hidden safety deposit boxes, crypto wallets, or rental properties. The $3.2 million hadn't funded a lavishly lived life. It vanished. Sadie expanded the search, pulling records back a decade. And there, underneath the relentless outflow of funds, she found the rhythm. Every month, a wire transfer of $9,500 went out. It was routed through one of the shell companies, but its final destination was always the same: Havenwood Continuing Care Facility. Havenwood is a well-renowned long-term care facility specializing in neurological and spinal cord trauma. Sadie circled it on the precinct board in thick red ink because of its terrifying consistency. The usual facts are criminals are normally impulsive. They bought sports cars, gambled, or even indulged in extravagant escapades. But they did not set up a specific decade-long automatic payment for what seemed to be hush money. To Sadie, the scheming didn't align with the normal pattern of a thief. It was the ritual of a caretaker. And caretakers, she knew, always had someone to answer to. Havenwood Continuing Care Facility was clean, welcoming, and structured. The administrator's name tag read Linda. She had kind eyes, yet a permanent crease of fatigue between her brows. She was politely bewildered by Sadie's badge and court order. She tapped at her keyboard, searching the requested name, Robert Benson. It turned out he'd been a guarantor there for nearly a decade. Linda spoke with the gentle reverence reserved for reliable payers in the world of Medicaid shortfalls and family disputes. When Sadie inquired about the guarantor, Linda's fingers paused with a flicker of professional protectiveness across her face. She turned her computer monitor, displaying a patient profile. Name, Corey Carson, age 32. Admission date, October 18, 2008. Status, persistent vegetative state. Guarantor, payer of record, Robert Benson. The letters seemed to pulse on the screen. Sadie's wall of professional detachment was instantly obliterated. She felt a slight tilting of the floor beneath her feet, as if the entire investigation had just pivoted on a single axis. She could not believe a community hero kept this kind of secret for a decade. Watching Sadie's whirlpool of emotion, Linda's face softened with a practiced empathy. She explained Corey's care plan: private room, 2-to-1 nursing care, physical therapy 3 times a week to prevent contractures. It was one of the most comprehensive and costly care plans in the facility. Linda further informed that Corey had no other family listed and no visitors, only Mr. Benson. He apparently read to Corey and played music every single Sunday since before she worked there. Sadie walked down the hallway in silence. Room 314. The door was partially open. She stood at the threshold, bearing witness. The room was quiet other than the symphony of the ventilator and the beep of the heart monitor. Tubes and wires formed a fragile matrix around the bed. In the center of the matrix was Corey Carson. His body was still, maintained with the clinical care that had preserved him from the wasting of time. His face was peaceful, unlined, and frozen in the eerie calm of a young man whose life stopped too soon. A sports magazine from a decade ago laid on the bedside table. A faint, outdated pop song played softly from a speaker on the windowsill. This was not a secret luxury or a repair of a mindless mistake. This was a tomb, an expensive tomb, and Robert Benson had been its sole keeper. The $9,500 a month wasn't a payoff, it was a ransom, paid to time, to fate, to his own conscience to keep this boy from disappearing entirely. Sadie leaned against the cool doorframe with a case file suddenly feeling heavy in her hand. The spreadsheets, the shell companies, the fraudulent invoices weren't the blueprint of a theft. They were the desperate, clumsy machinery of an atonement. The question was no longer, why did he steal? It was, what did he do? The case had stopped being about greed. It became a biography of guilt. Sadie sat silently in her office. She was preparing the story, the one that would make sense to a jury, the one the newspapers could print, the one that would let everyone sleep at night. Robert Benson, the community saint, had heard of the tragic accident that shattered Corey Carson's life. Moved by compassion, he had stepped in as a secret benefactor, quietly paying the staggering medical bills. But over time, the cost had become a crushing weight. His own resources dried up. Faced with the unthinkable choice of abandoning the boy or finding money elsewhere, he had begun siphoning from the one source that seemed bottomless, the untapped, trusting reservoir of the Benson Hope Foundation. He had stolen, yes, but he had stolen for a cause. It was a crime of the heart, a tragedy of good intentions gone awry. It was sympathetic, it was narratively clean, it would earn him a reduced sentence and a dozen tearful editorials, and every piece of it was wrong. Because the dates refused to cooperate, Sadie laid them out on her timeline in a chronology of guilt. Corey's accident, October 2008. First payment to Havenwood, November 2008. Incorporation of Benson Hope Foundation, March 2010. First fraudulent grant, June 2011. The $9,500 monthly payments had started a full year and a half before the foundation even existed, before there was a public charity to bleed dry. Robert Benson had begun paying for Corey's care with his own money or from a source Sadie hadn't yet found long before he turned to fraud. To try and get a grip on the whole story, she decided to pull Corey's accident report. Double-clicking the PDF, she found 5 pages from a police department notorious for closing difficult cases. The narrative was spare, almost perfunctory. Victim cycling, vehicle struck from behind, driver fled the scene, no suspects. The description of the vehicle was vague. The forensic details were minimal. It read like a report written to be filed, not resolved. It presented more like a burial than a cover-up. So Sadie dug. She requested the physical case jacket from the archives. 2 days later, a cardboard box arrived. Inside the main folder, clipped behind the final page, was a forgotten addendum sheet. It was a carbon copy, and in faded blue ink read, "Partial plate lodged by witness, Ms. G. Powell, 22M. Got maybe 3 numbers, thought it was a 4, a 7, or maybe a J or a K in the middle. Dark blue sedan, 4-door. Witness statement read, "Saw the man get out. He stood by his car for a minute, just staring. He wasn't old, maybe my son's age. He looked shocked, like he couldn't believe it. Then he just walked away, fast, heading toward the old commercial district." A note at the bottom in different ink read, "Vehicle located 10/20/08, was a dark blue 4-door Chevy Malibu. Abandoned in quarry lot east of town. VIN destroyed by fire. Registration traced to Arthur Felden, immigrated to New Zealand, 10/25/08, no further leads." Sadie's breath caught. She minimized the report and pulled up the article on the local newspaper website. She searched for Benson and community fundraiser, narrowing the date range to the years before the accident. She found it. A photo from a 2007 library benefit. Robert Benson, younger, his face unlined by the weight of a decade-long secret, stood holding an oversized check. He was wearing another suit. And parked at the curb behind him, visible in the crowd, was a dark blue 4-door Chevy Malibu. The description from the forgotten witness statement echoed in her mind. Dark blue sedan, four-door, male driver, early 40s, appeared shaken. The room seemed to grow still. The kind, self-effacing man from the award ceremony, the penitent visitor in the hospital room, the beloved pillar of the community, had been there at the very beginning, not as a rescuer, but as the case. The case wasn't about corrupted charity. It was about a hit and run covered first by flight, then for 10 long years covered by a monument of good deeds built with stolen money. The entire foundation, the youth center, and his entire public life wasn't an atonement. Inside, he was as lifeless as the child he had left at the scene, and that was the world's most elaborate plea. Robert Benson had not stolen money to help Corey Carson. He stole money to pay for him, a financial IV drip keeping the boy he'd ruined suspended between life and death. Month after month, year after year, the Benson Hope Foundation was never a wall to hide behind. It was a shrine, a living, breathing monument constructed around the silent screaming of Robert's guilt. Every after-school program was a vow that no child would be left unsupervised, and every scholarship for safe driving courses was an alibi. And every basketball court kept open until 10 p.m. was a ward against the haunting of that October night. The entire organization was a confession written plainly in the community service, a prayer offered in grant proposals. Sadie saw it now with clarity. The timeline wasn't a coincidence, it was a casualty. The hollow exhaustion in Jamie Benson's eyes wasn't from supporting a philanthropist, it was from sharing a life sentence of acquaintance. Robert never spoke of grace or forgiveness in his speeches. He only spoke of duty, of showing up, of bearing the weight you were given. He wasn't hiding money, he was desperately bleeding it out, dollar by dollar into the quiet room at Havenwood in attempts to stitch a wound that would never close. Sadie didn't go to the interrogation room. She didn't confront Robert with the photo, the plate, or dates. She went to the Benson home. She knew he would only confirm the facts she already knew. She just needed the stories behind the facts. Jamie Benson opened the door. Her face was pale but composed. She too knew this day would soon come. They sat in the kitchen to discuss the findings. Despite her frustration, Sadie didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She laid 3 dates on the table between them, written on a plain sheet of paper. October 17, 2008, the accident. November 1st, 2008, the first payment to Havenwood. And March 15, 2010, the day they drank their retirement account to zero. Jamie didn't cry. She simply looked at the dates, then closed her eyes as if pulling a memory from a deep, dark well. Jamie Benson spilled the story of her husband coming home that night, soaked to the skin. She claimed he was shaking so hard he couldn't get his keys out of the door, and how he kept repeatedly saying he didn't see the kid, it was so dark, and he just panicked. She went on to tell Sadie that Richard showed her where he'd left the car. He left it in an old quarry lot. She paused and began to confess that she'd driven him back out there. She and her husband took a can of gasoline from the garage and set the car on fire. Her reasoning for joining in on the crime was because he was her husband and because she was scared. The love in that house wasn't weak and fragile. It was a darker, more durable alloy, forged not in passion but in shared complicity. It was a silence that had filled the space between them for a decade. A silence that had built a youth center, funded scholarships, and paid for a boy's permanent, expensive twilight. It was the sound of a life bending itself around a single imperishable moment and choosing every day after to bear the weight rather than to let it crush them completely. In a courtroom, Robert Benson was stripped of the decade-long false narrative he worked so hard to create. He stood and pled guilty to every count of wire fraud, money laundering, and to the theft of public funds. His voice was clear and lacked remorse. He offered no explanation and never spoke Corey Carson's name. He never mentioned the rain, the headlights, or the smell of burning gasoline. He accepted the 16-year sentence the way a man accepts a terminal diagnosis. The fallout was quiet, administrative, and complete. Councilman Greer, who had championed the Foundation for Photo Ops and Political Capital, resigned when records prove he'd brushed aside vague audit concerns to protect a prized community partner. The Benson Hope Foundation was dissolved, its assets seized. The gymnasium where he'd been celebrated fell silent, the bouncing of basketballs replaced by the hollow echo of an empty space. The banner was taken down. Sadie Moran's final act was not prosecutorial, it was custodial. She personally oversaw the transfer of Corey Carson from the private guilt-funded care of Havenwood to a secure permanent state-funded facility. The care was competent, but it was not $9,500 a month care. It was the care a nameless bureaucracy provides. On her last visit to Havenwood, she stood in the doorway of room 314 one final time. The machine still sighed, and Corey's face was still untroubled by time. She found herself wrestling with a cold philosophical equation. Was a life sustained by a decade of soul and penance any more sacred than one abandoned by the original fleeing sin? The answer she knew would not be in the ledgers. In the town, Robert Benson became a Rorschach test. To some, he was a monster who used a child's tragedy to build a personal empire of lies. To others, he was a martyr, a man who broke the law to fulfill a moral debt, punished for caring too much. The debate played out in letters to the editor and over coffee counters, a way for people to argue about the nature of goodness itself. Sadie Moran never participated. She knew the truth was more unsettling than either side allowed. Benson wasn't trying to erase his crime. He was trying to outlast it. He wasn't building a legacy. He was servicing a debt built in perpetuity, using the community's faith as his currency. The story of Robert Benson isn't a warning about hidden evil. It's a more devastating lesson that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is try to build a heaven to atone for a hell they created, and that no amount of good deeds, no matter how brilliant or beloved, can ever be a substitute for a single terrible moment they are trying to redeem. And until next Wednesday, I'm Mimi, and this has been a step behind the yellow tape.